and we want to know who's all joining us today and what you hope to get out of the training. We're going to spend the beginning part talking about trends. So it's still kind of early in 2021, but we are going to take a reflection of 2020 and all the potential implications of COVID. So spend some time looking at data. Then we're going to talk about just overall fundraising for nonprofits and kind of what are those main revenue streams and how you can think about growing your pie as well as maybe diversifying your revenue. And then we'll finally talk about some plans and tactics of what you could do based on the trends that we've seen, as well as some other just overall trends that we're seeing in the nonprofit fund development community. And then we have a few handouts too that I believe Cheryl already shared with you. And so we'll make sure to go over those as well. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. So I'm excited that hopefully you can get a lot out of today. And I know this will always come up, but we do plan to share the slides with Cheryl, and then she can send them out to the list. So you will be able to get copies of the slides later. So as Cheryl mentioned, TCG, we're based in Indiana. We have staff across the state. We love to work with a variety of organizations. So we work with state government agencies. We work with nonprofit community-based organizations, with schools, higher education, and then also with community coalitions, foundations, United Way agencies. And so I think that really provides a unique perspective of the different seats of the table, so to speak, or sides of the table that we work with. We really focus on 3 areas of service. So really data-driven organization and do a lot with data analytics and evaluation of programs. We do a lot of building capacity for nonprofits, so board development, fund development, and program development and research. And then mobilizing communities where you have an issue that's bigger than what one agency could do on their own, and we want to come together collectively to do that. And then this is our kind of framework and really our approach of how we accomplish each project is we really are big participatory and collaborators with our clients and their clients, very data driven, and then building consensus and then being action oriented. So that's a little bit about our company. And we always like to start off by just understanding, what is your why? All of the clients that we work with just have such amazing, rich meaning and history behind their causes and the services that they're providing in their community. And so it's always helpful to just start with understanding what is your why for why you do what you do by working for your nonprofit and your organization, your community. And so for me, my why is goes back to my family and my childhood. My parents were foster parents for over 30 years. And so we took in over 100 different children and adopted children out of foster care. And so I feel like I had a very unique perspective and had a huge desire and heart to serve others, especially vulnerable children and families. And through internships and education, became really passionate about policies and systems and data and how we could be more effective to hopefully prevent child maltreatment and be more comprehensive in supporting vulnerable families and communities. And so that's really fueled my why and my career of getting involved and being a part of Transform. So tell me, if you go again to the slido.com, you should be able to have this question pop up as a word cloud. So just type in with like maybe 1 or 2 words, what is your why? Why are you working with, serving on your nonprofit, your cause, your community organization? If anyone has any issues, let us know. So right now it looks like there's about 30 on our training webinar, and hopefully we'll get at least 25 of you or so to answer. So I'll give you a little bit of time just to pull up the question. So I see a lot about community and giving back. If you look at the words, almost everyone has community in their word or their phrase. A lot of community focus. Okay. Well, I'm going to end it there, but if you want to go ahead and populate your answer still as you're pulling it up, but that's great. It seems like there's a lot of commitment and desire to really give back in your community and the different causes that you're passionate about. Okay, so going back specifically to our training topic for today, we really want to understand what is it that you want to learn about fundraising today and fund development? You know, what's something that you're hoping to walk away with understanding? Oops, I didn't mean to go back. No, sorry. There we go. Pressed the wrong button and it jumped me ahead. And I should also note that your answers are anonymous, so we don't really know who's typing. Not that hopefully anything seems really sensitive to share, but we really just do want to understand where everybody's at. Wow, you guys are asking some really great questions and topics, and I know that we are going to cover them, but this will also help us inform our part 2 for areas that we can go deeper with. I'm seeing a lot of folks saying they want to learn new strategies and creative ideas. Some people are saying, you know, where do I start with the process? How do I determine maybe what grant or what funding source is the best? How do I engage my donors or my board? And getting excited with our cause. So yes, we will cover a lot of this ground today, hopefully, and we're actually going to end by asking what we learned so we can circle back and hopefully check off the boxes. So as I mentioned, we're going to first start by talking about fundraising trends. And as I mentioned, we're still pretty early in the year for when some final trend reports will come out about overall giving. But we did have some reports recently come out that do give us a snapshot of what we see of how 2020 kind of panned out. So a lot of the data that I will be sharing is from the Blackbaud Institute. Many of you might know of them or use their funding source. They're a large donor management software program provider. And so they were able to pull together data from all the entities using that give us insight into just fundraising trends. So kind of to kick us off, what do we think? Has giving increased or decreased overall this last year in 2020 compared to 2019? So that'll be my first question is, what do we think? And perhaps you've seen some of these reports already that have come out. Do we think funding increased last year compared to 19? Okay, it looks like the majority of you said it increased, and you're correct. In 2020, even with all of the changes related to COVID, there was an overall increase, and we have seen that continue year over year. Fundraising has continued to increase. By how much and kind of who was on the winning side really varies. So overall, it was about a 2% increase. So not, off the charts here, but considering all the things that happened, that's certainly a positive outcome overall for the year. However, like I said, not everybody saw an increase, and I'm sure many of you could relate to this and could chime in. Overall, more of the medium and larger size nonprofits did see an increase with their funding. However, the small nonprofits were the ones who really struggled and saw a decrease in their funding. And some other interesting trends is that online giving increased, over a fifth in last year compared to previous years. So every year, online giving has also continued to rise significantly, but we saw a huge jump last year with online giving, which probably is not surprising considering how much has gone online this year and how many more individuals were really kind of forced to move in that direction of soliciting funds through online platforms. So let's talk a little bit more about this. When we looked at the giving trends, they're able to break it down by sectors, and you probably often see this whenever you look at fundraising data. So compared to the last year, the human services sector, again, not surprising, was the kind of real winner, if you will. Really funders or donors were most interested in supporting those basic needs. And how can we meet those basic needs? And so agencies that were in that kind of human services industry were the ones who are most likely to be recipients, whereas higher education and our arts community and the environment, who perhaps aren't as positioned as those basic needs, were the ones that saw a dip in their giving as donors reprioritize their funding allocations. On average, though, the amount that donors give really varies by sector, and that goes back to kind of who is giving and how you're soliciting those funds. So the average gift from an individual is just around $700, but you can see those who give to higher education is significantly higher compared to maybe, you're tithing through a faith-based or a church or religious organization or focus on animal welfare needs. So it's also interesting. What we like to do is kind of looking at your own industry of your cause and nonprofit and figuring out kind of where do you fit against some of these benchmarks to see, are we above that average or are we below? And is there potentially room to grow? Some other things to look at is when we did see an increase of online giving, it's still a relatively smaller amount. So individuals who are giving those larger gifts are not doing so via online giving. What you are attracting are those smaller, newer donors, individuals giving smaller gifts, which certainly adds up over a period of time. But the average online gift is just under $200. So one thing that we wanted to ask was, when we think about just the overall trends of giving, where do we think the end of the year campaign ended? How much does the end of the year, the last quarter, still account for annual giving? There was a big shift of giving during the kind of March to May period, and we actually had that additional special kind of Giving Tuesday earlier on in the spring. And so there was concern that we wouldn't see tithing or giving as much the end of the year campaign that we see. So where do you think kind of overall giving, how much comes in that last quarter of the year? And again, this can be interesting for you to kind of compare where your agency's end of the year giving stands in relation to kind of these national trends. Okay, let's see. All right. So the majority of you were right. Last year, over a third of annual giving occurred in the last quarter of the year. So that last quarter of the year is still a very strong period of when funding came in for organizations. Again, this is an average. So for some of you, that might be a higher percentage or slightly lower. But what we know is that while many donors did come out in full force in the spring period during the shutdown and the height of COVID, individual donors and others still came forward at the end of the year, and it was a strong quarter for giving. So talking more about online gifts, I talked about that there was an increase, but when we look about the overall funding that comes in for an organization, you know, what percentage does online gifts account for overall fundraising dollars still? So 4%, 31%, or 22%. Okay. So online giving still only accounts for about 13% of our overall fundraising dollars. So while we continue to see this funding source grow, it's still a smaller slice of the pie, so to speak, and one that we'll probably continue to see grow and saw a big jump up, but it's still not up there yet. So knowing some of these funding trends that we've been able to pull out, and again, it's still preliminary, we haven't seen the final analysis of all the data that's come in, what are some implications for giving in 2021? So right now it's projected that we still anticipate to see an increase overall in giving in 2021. Donors and other partners are still seeing the need in their community with COVID and the critical role that organizations play in supporting and addressing communities. So that continues to grow. A big push that we're also seeing is those small dollar donors. So individuals who are just giving those one-time $25, $50, $100 gifts are critical for nonprofits and especially for smaller nonprofits. And so you really want to embrace those small dollar donors, and certainly having an online presence. We saw a big increase there. It's not going to be the one that's going to save your budget, but is one that continue to focus on and grow and can be a potentially lower cost option for fundraising. And then there have been questions and concerns from many of our clients. Are donors tired of being asked? And their response is no. Resist the myth of donor fatigue. It is not too late or too often to go back to your donors. And in fact, we're going to talk more towards the end about the critical role that communication plays in engaging with your donors and with your funders to really help them understand where your organization's at, where your community is at, where your services are at, how you're responding and adapting and adjusting to those needs, and how potentially they want to continue to partner and support you. While many have been financially impacted by COVID and just the economic downturn and challenges, many have not and are still willing to kind of come forward and give or give more. So we're going to break up into our first small group discussion. Fingers crossed, our Zoom breakout rooms will work here. And so we want to just have a conversation with our peers and each other to talk about how have you seen these fundraising trends, play out at your organization? Have you been on that kind of receiving side of seeing some increases or changes with donors and engagement? And what are potential insights that you have for your organizations of looking at some of those preliminary trends? So we will break up into our small group for about 8 minutes, and you guys can introduce each other first, and then Amanda, myself, and Danae will help facilitate that discussion. So,
okay, Amanda, I have them set for 8 minutes, and then everyone will get a warning when you have 30 seconds left. So I will open
perfect.
those.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, I think we are all back now. So for each group, I'll start with Amanda. You want to share what were some insights that your team shared? Some takeaways?
So overall, everybody expressed that the trends that you shared in 2020 were really consistent with what they saw in their own organization. We had several that rely on some of those larger events and really had to adapt quickly to cancellations and just figuring out other ways to boost those dollars. And so we talked a little bit about the shift that they've already made in 2021 with just what they've learned in the last year and kind of anticipating some continued challenges to come.
Mm-hmm. That's great. How about your group, Danae?
Yeah, so our group once again also kind of felt like the trends were on par for them. Many of them experienced pretty much kind of what we've been seeing with the data. And so that stayed true for our group as well. Also just planning 2019, several of them had some good years in 2019, and that really helped sustain them over 2020, along with some grants that people were able to get. And so, and the PPE loans as well. And so people kind of were able to make it through for 2020 and are really looking forward to kind of a new year and a new start, and learning kind of how to diversify their funding as well. And also just, as we were leaving, they were talking, starting to kind of talk about technology and just really how to invest in that and how to use that moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's really consistent with our small group as well. They felt like those trends were consistent. We had some arts nonprofits, we had some human services, and so those kind of sector trends were consistent with what they had experienced. And then also shared how some pivoted their online events or their fundraising events to use online platforms in that technology system. So we're certainly seeing a lot of those trends play out. Well, let's talk now that we kind of have a snapshot of some of the landscape and trends happening that could inform our work. Let's talk a little bit more about like our funding streams. And what we ought to talk about a lot is that there's a pie of funding for nonprofits. And so we think about like, how do we grow our pie? And then also how do we diversify, which have been some of those key questions and topics. So at TCG, we think about funding for nonprofits in kind of 5 core areas of funding streams. So we look at it from donors to fee for services, corporate sponsorships, grants, and fundraising events. And we know not all nonprofits organize your financial statements and your revenue under these categories, but I'm sure that you could pull out one of your financial statements and kind of look at it and see how you do have it broken out across those different areas. So we're going to talk a little bit more about each of those 5 areas briefly, and kind of highlighting, what's included within this funding stream, and then what are some pros and cons, because we do want to have a pie, but there's not a magic formula for each agency. So it doesn't need to be that you need to have 20% of your funding coming from each of these categories. What we do suggest and recommend, though, is there is some diversity and you're not reliant on one over another for a variety of reasons. So talking first about individual donors. Individual donors is a pretty broad category. And so you, again, might classify this under multiple subcategories, but we like to look at it kind of holistically. So individual donor kind of funding stream is really individuals who give to your organization, plain and simple. And so you might look at them as individuals who give through your online giving platforms, Donate Now, whatever that tool or resources that you have on your social media or online platforms, individuals who give through an annual campaign, your annual mailing or letter, kind of making an ask and a pledge to give. Then you have your major gift donors. So these are individuals that you've been cultivating relationship over a period of time to give, 5-6 figure gifts to really support your organization and really help them understand they want to leave a legacy behind in their community. This also would include capital campaign donors, individuals who are wanting to contribute when you're making enhancements to your facility, or you're building a new facility, or expanding a facility or location. And so you often will have a kind of donation opportunity for individuals to give through that capital campaign. And then we have planned giving bequest donors. So individuals thinking about what the legacy is they want to leave behind. And so how you are going to be written in as a part of their kind of planned giving for the future. And we're also seeing more individuals are starting to enact those planned giving bequests and not waiting until the loved one passes away. So kind of thinking holistically across these different donors. And so when you look at that list, you might think, gosh, we're not really capturing or cultivating a relationship with that kind of donor. What can we do to potentially grow that relationship? Individual donors have the potential to give from anywhere to, $5, $10, $15, all the way up to, six-figure multi-million-dollar gifts. And so there's a real range of breadth of what your giving could look like as you work to develop a relationship and stewardship program of different individuals. As I mentioned, there are pros and cons with every funding stream. And so there's not a perfect source that's going to meet all your needs. So on the pro side, one of the things that we love the most, and probably you as well, is the unrestricted funds, typically that come with those individual donations. Donors are usually supportive of your overall cause, your overall agency, and really are, trusting you to make a good, wise investment and be a good steward of their gift. And so there's less strings and requirements that you have to follow with those funding streams, which is really important because that can really pay for your administrative costs, your overhead costs, or your costs to innovate and do things beyond what some of your other more restricted funding streams allow you to do. Individual donors also have the potential to be large gifts, and they can be a multi-year funding stream. So an individual maybe give that planned gift or major gift over a period of years, as well as they tend to be an ongoing. In our small group, we talked about donor retention. And so once you do attract or retain a donor and they give, how do you cultivate that relationship and keep them engaged within your cause and organization so they give over a period of time? On the con side, it takes time. It also takes dedicated staff and volunteers and your board to be able to cultivate these relationships with individuals in your community, to take them from that one-time gift to really kind of developing a long relationship with them. It also can take systems and infrastructure. So you really are starting to collect data to understand your donors, to understand, the average age of your donor, the average gift amount, your donor retention rate. Those are all very important to kind of go through and mine your data to really understand how you can deepen and strengthen your individual donor giving program. Like I said, feel free to drop in any comments as I kind of go through these questions, but we'll have another breakout as well. So fee for service, this might be something you don't think about, but we have a blog on our website, and I'll share that information at the end. One of our top blogs that we have is, can I charge for my services? Certainly as a nonprofit, you can charge for your services. There are many organizations who do that. The main thing is that you are reinvesting those funds to supporting your program. So it is another revenue stream, which is essentially just saying you have a rate or a fee that you are going to provide your service. Many agencies do that. So you think about youth programs. There's a lot of youth programs that will have some type of a fee for their before or after care program, their summer camp program, arts and music lessons, and lots of things. A lot of our therapeutic programs, there's a fee, and typically there might be a sliding scale fee. Job training programs, workforce development programs. There are so many different ways or organizations that are charging some type of a fee to cover their services. It may not cover the whole cost, or it may. It just depends on how you determine to market and understand that. And also within that kind of fee for service bundle is you can secure or procure contracts with different vendors. So whether you're a service provider that has a contract with a state government agency or your local government agency or school district to provide services, there are a lot of different ways that you can have that. It somewhat operates like a grant, but not necessarily. And like I said, the range here can vary. So you can have, an hourly rate that maybe it's just a few hundred or a few $1,000s that you're securing through your fee for service, all the way up again to having multi-million-dollar contracts, depending on the nature of your services. Again, some of the pros are that you're setting the rate. And so in a way, you can kind of help control this by, in a way, being a salesperson and marketing your services and cultivating those relationships with potential clients and partners who benefit from your services. Especially if you procure contracts, they tend to be multi-year contracts. So there's some sustainability of that funding source. And you as the kind of provider, you determine what's included and not included in that rate and kind of have more control over setting that rate. Obviously some cons with the funding sources, depending on how you market your program, it can be a bundled or a fixed rate that may not cover all of your costs. And so you just need to think about, okay, what does it really take to break even? So I ensure I'm not losing money on this, or just know that I'm going to fundraise or provide other sources to secure that. And again, there can be time involved with trying to secure those contracts, build relationships, do marketing, do outreach to build that client base. And again, sometimes there are more restrictions with the fund. So these fee for services, especially through a contract, are not as unrestricted as we might like. And we have more limitations of what we can do with that. I would say also in this last year, we saw that organizations who typically provide for our services, when your referrals are down, like you cannot provide an after school program or a summer camp program, therefore, or you're limited to, serving less because of social distancing, that revenue stream went really down. So many who are more reliant on this funding stream really saw a hit to their budget when they didn't have those referrals for counseling sessions or summer camp spots as well. Checking to see if there are some comments that come up, and we can make sure to answer those. So the third category of funding that we talk about is corporate sponsorships. And so sometimes we see organizations will kind of bundle this under their fundraising events, because that tends to go one-on-one there. But we also like to look at it a little more broadly. And essentially a corporate sponsorship is where a company and a nonprofit have formed a partnership. A lot of times a company will do this through their corporate giving arm, where they have so much funding allocated to give to the community, depending on how they have it structured at their company. Or more and more companies are looking to do what we call cause marketing, where they can kind of market that they are doing good in their community and promoting their, company products, benefits, services, etc. Companies are really seeking ways to partner with nonprofits that align with their overall mission and their values in the community. And that can really change depending on the leadership at a company. Some examples of a corporate sponsorship program might be a company who's in the STEM industry, and they're really invested in wanting to grow a talent pipeline of more engineers or IT support. And so they partner with a youth nonprofit to create a STEM program. And they're going to sponsor that program by giving $25,000 or whatever. Maybe that goes to purchase the supplies, it might go to hire staff, etc. They have their name and their branding on the program materials, are sponsored by, or they get more exposure. And they're seeing that potentially as a long-term investment for potential workforce development in their community, as well as a way to give back. So that's just one example where we see all sorts of partnerships. We've seen it where a childcare is able to reach out to local dermatology offices and wants to get sunscreens for their playground to protect the children and shield them from sun and damaging their skin. And so that's a good mission alignment with the dermatologist and wanting to help protect health and skin and well-being. And so that was a great partnership opportunity there. The sponsorships can really vary, and what we're seeing more of a trend of is working towards those multi-year sponsorships. So you're not chasing those corporate partners every year. And similar for them, they can kind of do more planned giving over a period of time. And so we're seeing more movement to 3- and 5-year sponsorship programs. The range, again, will vary depending on how you structure it and where you can find that sweet spot of what the company's alignment and priorities are for, and your nonprofit's alignment and priorities are, and how you can hopefully create a good partnership and a win-win for both entities. And some of the pros are those sponsorship dollars tend to be more unrestricted and have less strings than our grants or contracts might look like. We are seeing more larger gifts, again, building that relationship and communication and that multi-year funding to provide some more sustainability. The cons are just that relationship building and the time that's needed to really cultivate those relationships and communication and understanding. And then if there are leadership changes at a company, having to start that process over. And then again, with COVID, we did see this kind of funding bucket really get hit, where a lot of companies kind of paused their giving as they were really concerned about the economy. Some were obviously having to furlough depending on the industry that they were in, their workforce or downsize. So we saw many who were pulling back. On the flip side, there were others who were really doing well, or very committed to their community and wanting to move forward. So I'm sure that you've seen some kind of on both sides of the aisle there. Looking at grants, which I saw earlier, there were some comments around accessing grants. So a grant is really where you're applying to a foundation or a government agency to support a specific need for your organization. And there are different types of funders who have grants. So we look at it through kind of two categories. Private foundations and United Way agencies. So we've got private foundations, corporate foundations, family foundations, community foundations. So in the foundation world, there are lots of different types of foundations in your community. Some are staffed, like the Montgomery County and the Putnam County, and some are not staffed, and they're simply a volunteer group like a family foundation. United Way agencies also are giving out grants. So you might have a United Fund or United Way. And then there are government grants that are competitive opportunities through your local, state, or federal opportunity. Grants range from a one-time single-year grant that annually you might have to apply for again and again, and or some grants that are multi-years that you can again have this funding source for 3 or 5 years. We are seeing slowly a movement towards more multi-year grants as more funders are wanting to see impact and realizing that that doesn't happen in 1 year. We are seeing more movement of funders towards impact grant making, where they are very focused on a specific outcome. We want to address student achievement. We want to end homelessness, and they want to pull their funds around specific causes to do that. Grants, again, really vary from what we would kind of see as small, under $5,000, to large multi-million-dollar grants. And so there's a whole range there of what that looks like for you. On the pro side is grants can be a multi-year funding source. So again, a sustainability that you don't have to annually go after, depending on the grant. They can be a larger size grant to really give momentum to kicking off an initiative or providing that funding for staffing. Also, they can support new programs or initiatives. So if you're wanting to explore kind of enhancing a service area or launching something new, that tends to be a really good alignment for a grant opportunity. The cons are they are restricted funding. So there are strings attached to how you can use and expend those funds. There's reporting requirements. So a lot of times we look at what the reporting requirements are for a $1,000, $5,000, $15,000 grant and think maybe it's not worth our time to do this grant. We could be, soliciting other funding streams. There's also applications that you have to fill out, and that can take time and be very complicated. It may require additional external support and just time to find grants to do the research to prepare all those applications. And then the fifth category of funding is fundraising events. And I heard some people talk about how they did retool their fundraising events this last year with COVID. And so a fundraising event is where you're hosting some type of a gathering to raise money for your organization. So typically we think of, golf outings, 5K events, gala events where you get all dressed up, or you have a breakfast, lunch, dinner, fundraising event, those types of things. And some people have these fundraising events because they want to raise awareness and they see it as a platform where they'll have a program and speakers kind of share about the need and the cause, or they truly just see it as a fundraising event and they're wanting to generate money. Our focus is always to say, know your purpose. Is it truly meant to be awareness building, or is it really meant to generate money? We also encourage clients to look at the ROI, the return on investment. We will hear clients and they'll show us, look, we made $25,000 or $30,000, but then we don't factor in all the costs that went into putting that event on, as well as all the time of staff and volunteers. And so when we factor all of those out, sometimes we see a negative. Actually, we lose money on fundraising events. A lot of nonprofits are losing money on fundraising events. I will say that again. A lot of nonprofits are losing money on fundraising events. Some are doing very well. You have a well-oiled machine. You're making, 5-6 figures, and it's great. You have a committee that does it, minimal staff time involved, very mission aligned, a great PR event. Many are not and are losing money. So it really varies what we see there. So as I mentioned, some of the pros are Those events can be a great opportunity to build awareness. You usually have a program and a platform, so many see it as an educational opportunity. It's a way potentially to attract new donors and sponsors to be involved and give to your organization. And those events can generate unrestricted funds, so you don't have the strings. The cons are it can be very time consuming to put on these events through all the volunteers and the committees and the staff time. We have our clients track that to see, and it's quite shocking for many. So that would be something to do if you haven't, is kind of do an audit of your events and see how much time are we putting into putting this event on and really calculate what that ROI is. And sometimes the events, there's a crowded market. There's a lot of golf outings or 5Ks or gala events. And so, you know, how do you come up with something different in your community that people will want to come to and support and give? Also, if you're, you know, going to sponsors or individuals to kind of attend and it's all the same thing, especially in our rural communities, it's hard to attract new people to come to our event as well. So that's what we think of when you think of a crowded market. Before I go to the next question, I think I saw some chats in the question.
Yeah, there are a few questions that also came through on Slido, Amanda. I don't know if you see those or not.
I don't. Yeah. So, Amanda, if you can let me know and I'll try to respond to them.
So the first question was how to identify income sources.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that next section under the plan. But what we recommend doing is to take your revenue that you have and to try to go back to those 5 funding streams and try to allocate it accordingly. So hopefully you're, you know, whatever accounting software you're using, whether it's QuickBooks or even Excel, you know, we have seen all sorts of systems to try to allocate your funds accordingly to see where's your money coming in.
The other question was a little more specific around the grants. If you have an emergency that requires you borrow money for a roof repair, can that loan money be repaid with future grant money? So kind of that question of how.
Yes. I would say most likely no, but you never know. A lot of times the grants are really meant to be used for future expenses. So not many funders allow you to include costs that have already been occurred. But it's possible that there are funding streams out there, again, depending on your funder, that might pay for those types of things. There are grants that will cover capital type projects or infrastructure projects or operating. Not always, you know, we see more funders who are wanting to, like I said, fund impact and kind of direct programs and services. But what we like to say, and we could have a whole session on each of these 5. I feel like I am doing a complete injustice by just quickly going over these, but I'll be curious to find out kind of which of the 5 you might want more in-depth knowledge on, because we do topics on trainings on each of these. But again, with the grants, it's really about developing relationships with those funders and building partnerships. So I'm sure many of you have relationships with your community foundation and your United Way and potentially other funders. So they understand, you know, who you are, what your cause is, what's your focus in the community, and also what are their priorities, and figuring out where do you best support and align each other. So I hope that answered that question. So when you think about those 5 funding streams, which of these would you say is your top revenue? Where do you get the greatest amount of funding in? Okay, it looks like donors and grants are tied. And it's very interesting. We've been with many clients who are kind of one or the other, where they are really grant heavy and they have just not really developed a donor stewardship program. And there's pros and cons with that. And then on the flip side, we've seen others who are very donor heavy and they've never really gone after grants, and that's very scary for them. So again, thinking about when you look at the pie, what are ways that you can grow the pie, increase that overall total dollar amount, and then also diversify and potentially grow those different buckets based on what your goals are and what you're wanting to accomplish. So it looks like grants are our top, and then followed by donors as a top funding source. So very interesting. And then also curious to see over the past 5 years. So we know COVID last year was a real interesting year for many of us, and we're not really sure how that's going to pan out. But when you think more of a 5-year time span, have you seen changes in your funding streams? Have you seen that shift? And we were very grant heavy, and now we've started to move to be more donor focused, or we've moved to, really generate more corporate sponsors, whatever that might look like. So some changes, no changes, or major changes. Just curious to see how that's been shaping out. Okay, some people are still waiting to answer the question. Well, so far it looks like the top leader is no changes. So it looks like your funding streams have been pretty consistent for about a little over a third here. But for the most of you, just under 40%, there was no changes. And then some have seen major changes with your funding, and then others have seen some changes. And this can come depending on, again, your industry. Maybe there's just been a lot of changes of how your programs and services are delivered and the best, method and way to do that. It could be based on leadership changes in your organization, and new leadership comes in, whether it's the board or the staff, and have a real vision or different experience. Some leaders are more gifted in the grant writing space, and others might be more gifted in the contract procurement or donor stewardship. So in addition to looking at those funding streams, one of the resources that we shared with you is this kind of funding assessment. I don't know if you even call it an assessment. It's more of a continuum. So when we think about funding, there's kind of 9 core areas that we think are essential that you should have and be thinking about to support your fund development plan and funding kind of overall for your organization. And so it's organized in these 3 areas. And I do, our attribution is to the Boys and Girls Club of America, and we've kind of modified this from the work that they did there. But looking at data management, so as I alluded to earlier, we really need to have data systems in place. And we've seen anything from using Excel or Word, you don't have to purchase an off-the-shelf system, to purchasing, a donor-specific software, but having some way that you're tracking the donations you're receiving, the grants you're receiving, the different funding sources, having dedicated staff, having policies in place. So how do you accept and receive different gifts, and what are the different kind of policies around that? Communications and funding go hand in hand. You really can't separate them at all. And just having an overall plan and looking at your stewardship, which is cultivating donors. Your board needs to be engaged, and we have a whole board development and fundraising training, talking about diversifying and then having a gift strategy. So you can see these 9 columns. You could go through with your board or your staff and say, where do we fit across this continuum? This is like that foundational level of where we'd want everybody to be at. And then these are ways that you can advance and continue to strengthen your fund development program at your nonprofit. So you might find yourself kind of a checkered box that you have somewhere over here in the legacy column, which would be amazing. And then you have some over in the advancing, and you're kind of across the board of where you're at in your fund development program. Are there any other questions before I move on, or we break up? So some of the takeaways about looking at your funding would be, 1, just understand what that current breakout is across those funding streams. And once you determine that, just know that each funding stream has benefits and drawbacks. So it's not one is better than the other. It's really what are your needs for your organization and which revenue stream is the best. Do you need unrestricted funds because you're wanting to be innovative or go beyond, or you have internal costs that grants or contracts won't cover? Well, then you need to develop a donor program that will really pull in more unrestricted funds, for example. Do you want to have more multi-year funding and more sustainability? So perhaps you're going to pursue grants that are larger scale or contracts that provide that more sustainable funding source. And that goes to knowing your purpose and need for funding, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And also just continue to reassess your funding in alignment with program and organizational needs. Are your current funding streams meeting your needs and what you're wanting to accomplish with your strategic plan and priorities for the organization? And then also be just monitoring trends in your industry. We do some work in child welfare. And so that whole industry is having a huge shift of how the federal government and state government is funding child welfare and reallocating funds more towards prevention. That has huge implications for foster care and residential care agencies. That's just one industry, for example. And so just knowing kind of what's coming down the pipeline and how could that have implications for our industry, and are we best situated from a financial standpoint to leverage this potential funding opportunity or to be negatively harmed, and it's an external threat that we need to be prepared for. And then look at those infrastructure and systems that we have in place. Do we have some type of a data tracking system? Do we have policies in place? Do we have staff, whether that's staff or volunteers who are really investing in our fundraising efforts? Do we have a plan? And kind of going through that crosswalk to really understand what are some key infrastructure that we need to have in place. Okay, so I know that was a very meaty section. Like I said, we do those in like their own training. So that was a high level overview, but we do want to go back into our small groups and kind of discuss with each other, what are those funding streams that you want to grow? What are the ones that you want to strengthen? And how can you enhance your infrastructure and systems to do that? So Sarah, you want to kick us out?
Yep. Are you good with 8 minutes again?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, great. I think everybody is back. So I'm going to try to go through our last section here. We won't have time to share out just to make sure we get through everything and can answer any other questions that people have. But we did want to introduce to say, okay, how do we get started? I know that was a few questions at the beginning of the process. And so when we think about understanding what our current funding is and having that first step of the process, then we figure out, okay, how do we want to, like I said, grow the pie? So we want to increase our total giving and also diversify our revenue streams, figuring out which pieces of the pie seem to be most aligned with our goals right now and ones that we really want to target so we can see an overall increase and alignment of our goals. And when we think about financial goals, we really align it to our outcomes, again, tying it back to our impact. So when you're going out to raise funding for your organization, whatever that method is or that bucket is that you're doing it, it's always back to your impact. We're not going out to ask for money. We're going out to ask to support our programs, to meet the need in our community, to move the needle in this way. And so it really starts with just framing our message. And so having that mindset of, because I know many people are like, I don't want to fundraise. I don't want to ask for money, but we're not asking for money. We're asking for a partnership to support our goals, to help address this need in our community. So it really starts with that mindset shift and framing your mission. And I take it back to, what's your why? Why are you raising money? Why are you going after a grant? What is that need that you're meeting? Why are you securing and trying to raise $100,000 or $20,000? What is it that you're addressing in your community? So always have a clear and compelling why of what it is that you're wanting to accomplish with this funding that you're seeking to secure. And then that's where those partnerships, those potential funders will naturally come into play. So my one last question here is, do you have a fundraising plan that really outlines what your fundraising goals are and your strategies and your tactics to accomplish that? Many of you might have a strategic plan, and then a part of that strategic plan, you might have a goal supporting fundraising, but this would be a complementary plan to your strategic plan that's specific to fundraising. Okay. Looks like most of us do not have a fundraising plan. So that was the other template that we did share with you, was just a brief template that I've kind of copied here. And so a fundraising plan is really, again, looking at it in sections of your report. And so what we would do is kind of say, what's our mission for our organization? What's been the history of fundraising in our organization? And so that's where I talked about the financial analysis over the last few years. And we like to pull data from 5 or 10 years ago. I asked you a question earlier of, how have you seen your funding change over the last 5 or 10 years? And so 5 years maybe is not long enough of a snapshot. It really probably just depends for your organization. And again, what have been some changes there? Because that can really give us some insight of, oh, wow, like we used to be higher with grants and now we're here. Maybe that was strategic, maybe that wasn't. And so let's understand what's happened. So pull those financial statements, work with your CFO, your treasurer, whoever, to kind of pull those buckets together. We like to do benchmarking research as part of the fund development plan. So it does help to kind of do a snapshot of peers in your community. Has anyone ever pulled 990? These are those tax statements you have to file as a nonprofit, but do you ever pull them to look at your peers? So if you're in a youth serving organization or arts agency, you might want to look at other arts agencies across the state or in your region to see how much money are they raising and what does their kind of breakdown of funding look like? And, am I on track with that or am I far off? So we look at it by industry or sector, but then we also look at 990 research by your community. So kind of what's the giving trend in our community? What's the potential for giving? There's some census data that has some benchmarking research that we could pull together, as well as pulling some of those 990s. And that really helps us understand what's the giving potential and are we really maximizing and leveraging what's that potential in our community. And then once we've gathered this information, then we really start to set those goals. So we want to raise $1 million or 5 years, or our current budget is 800 and we want to raise another 100. And so we want to get to 900. We're going to do it by, increasing this much more in this bucket and this much more in this. We're going to launch whatever that is, right? So we set those kind of strategic goals, maybe 3, no more than 5. And then we're going to break it down into action steps and tactics and milestones and how you're going to go about accomplishing that. So if you want to grow your giving program, maybe we're going to launch a young professional society because we want to attract more millennials. Maybe we're going to tap into our alumni, individuals that have come through our program and now they're adults. We want to bring them back into our program and they might feel led to give. We want to launch a women giving program, more today than ever. Women are in a position of leadership and wealth, and so they have the potential to give. And you speak with women differently than you do with men. And so maybe you're going to grow a women giving program. So lots of different ways that you want to be specific to do that. Kind of, again, outlining who, what, how, and when, those tactics. So a very high level there of our plan. Some other tips to just kind of wrap up and take away of these trends is ask, ask, ask. We don't get because we don't ask. And so just, again, you're not asking for money, you're asking for people to join your cause, to support your goals, to accomplish and meet the need in the community. Donor retention is most important. So your greatest donors are the ones you have. Don't lose them. How do we retain those donors and how do we help cultivate them to invest more in supporting the organization and to help them understand your goals and your priorities? I think more so this last year has taught us like how important it is to get back to basics, to pick up the phone and to call all of our donors, to just check in with them and ask, how are you doing? What is going on with you? How has this affected your family? How has this affected your work? Maybe you don't even ask during that call. You just keep that relationship open. We're sending handwritten thank you notes or just sending a handwritten check-in, doing a phone drive. And so there's a lot of those like back to basic fundraising methods that are just so important to do during this period. And again, engaging with that next generation of donors. Our boomers are a critical funding group because of the wealth transfer that's going to happen with them as they pass and wanting to capture those planned gifts. but also we need to cultivate a new generation of donors who are very different than our boomers, as many of you know, and that cultivates different communication strategies and different tactics. So we want to kind of be looking at both of those bookends. And then if you don't have a planned giving program, definitely consider it because of the wealth transfer that is happening right now and will be underway for the next decade or more. Additional is, I would say, your individual donors are your top priority. And again, this is general, so your agency might have different tactics there, but we would suggest focusing on growing that donor stewardship program, focusing on major gifts where possible. And then after you have that in place, look at those grants and look at corporate sponsorships, and then reevaluate your events and see if that's the best use of your time. We think it's probably better used in cultivating donors. But again, you're going to just reevaluate and assess where you're at. And this is a great quote from the co-founder of Habitat of Humanity is, "I've tried raising money by asking for it and not asking for it. And I always get more by asking for it." So if we don't ask, we don't get. And so you can't ask enough by having people come along to support your cause. So lastly, we want to end by just asking what's one thing you learned, and then I'm going to go into the questions here. So go back to your Slido. So I'm reading through some of the questions. Yep. So yep, GuideStar is our go-to source for accessing those 990 statements. Yes, and I think we had a blog, so thanks for sharing that, Amanda. My only caveat with the 990 is there is kind of a delay, so they may not be the most current. It's usually 1 or 2 years behind, but those are all publicly available. Okay, I'm seeing a lot about diversity, wanting to diversify funding, looking to partner, looking at attracting donors, knowing that there's pros and cons for each funding source, which is great. Yes, and I will just quickly share. So this is the funding, the handout that Cheryl shared with everybody. So we kind of just created a template here that we use, and then also gave the kind of continuum to help you really assess internally where your organization is at related to these fundraising goal areas. So I'll go back to our word cloud here. Hopefully that didn't kick anybody out. Any other questions in the chat that people have? Okay, well, as I alluded to, on our website, we do have a newsletter. We just send it out once a month. We don't spam you. So if you'd like to just follow us and sign up for more tips and resources, we also have a wealth of blogs on our website too, and you can just search by clicking on fundraising and find a lot of these tips and resources there. And we'd always be happy to talk with you more if you have specific questions. Any other questions or comments? I think we're about right on time.
We are. Hearing no further questions, I want to thank Amanda and her team from Transform for a wonderful presentation today. We look forward to the follow-up next month, the fundraising and COVID. We still have not made a determination whether that will be a live event or a virtual event, but we will be doing that soon, and we will get that information out to you. Just want to remind you, Montgomery County folks, our first grant cycle of 2021 is coming up here soon. The grant deadline is April 5th, and then in the fall, there will be a second grant cycle. You can find those application links on our website, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about that. Again, I want to thank Putnam County and Hoosier Heartland. And now I want to ask Sarah to draw to see who the lucky winner is of Chamber Bucks.
Okay, our winner is Lavinia Hale. Is she still on with us?
Is she Montgomery County?
No, I'm not Montgomery County.
Okay, sorry, you were on my Montgomery County list.
Oh, we have a Hale in
We'll try
Montgomery
that
County. I
again.
wonder if that's how that happened.
How about Ken Clark? I know he's from Montgomery County.
He is. And
He's
he
still
was
here.
on in our last chat. Are you still here, Ken?
Yes. Yay.
All right.
Yay. I will be sending a link to the Chamber Bucks to you today, Ken. And thank you all for spending time with us and learning more about fundraising. I think it's good every now and then to start back at the beginning and get that overall look at where we need to be going. So again, I thank you all for joining us and hope to see you live or virtually in April.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Good to see you. Look forward to seeing you next month.